But usually they just write Tibetan. So the Ladakhi, the language they speak in Tibetan and in Ladakhi, in many languages, the written and the spoken are quite different. Like in English, the written has been adjusted over the years and been aligned with the spoken English, right? You don't write like Shakespeare in English any longer. But Tibetans still write the way they wrote 800 years ago.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So that's why it's different than Ladakhi, where kind of like a little...
No, that's not why. Like when you have different dialects, like I don't know if you know, in the US, usually you speak pretty much, I mean, there are differences in dialect, but you can understand. But you may have heard of Swiss German versus German. So, pardon?
In Arabic, there are a lot.
In the Arabic communities, yes, there are many different dialects, and sometimes it's hard to understand. So I would say, like, Swiss German for me is very difficult to understand. I understand a few words, but not the whole thing. So similar is Tibetan and Ladakhi. They, you know, like Tibetan, the Tibetan language is such that when you write it down, there are certain silent letters, so-called silent letters. Like you have letters that are not pronounced in Tibetan. But in Ladakhi they pronounce it, because that's the ancient way of saying it. It's nice, you know how to spell it when you know Ladakhi. In Tibetan, since you don't pronounce every letter, it's sometimes difficult to spell, because when you sound it out, it doesn't sound like there's this extra letter. So I'll give you an example.
So the Dao, Gao, the spirit?
Not just that, like for instance, you say Tenzin in Tibetan. Tenzin, like Tenzin Gyatso is the name of His Holiness, Tenzin Gyatso. So actually it is spelled Mstenzin, Mstenzin. So it's like a letter Pao. Yeah. And then there's a Sa that's usually silent. That indicates it's high pitched. But in Tibetan you say Tenzin, but you spell it Stenzin. And Gyatso is Gyamso. So like in Amdo they also pronounce the silent letters. So it's a Ra, Ga, Ya. So actually it would be Gya, Gya. So everyone just says Gya. And then Gya, that would be like they say it in Amdo, Gya. I can't even do it because it's all these letters. But in Tibetan you just say Gya. And Gyatso means ocean. So, but there's a Ma before the Tso. So they say Gyamtso, Gyamtso. Yeah. And that way in normal spoken Tibetan, they say Tenzin Gyatso. In Ladakhi they would say Tenzin Gyamtso. In Amdo I guess they would say Tenzin Gyamtso. So in that way it's pronounced differently, yeah. And I probably don't get the pronunciation right, actually. Like, they have a very specific way of speaking. But, so to answer your question, they therefore, some words are different, some words are pronounced differently, and so it sounds pretty different. But you kind of understand some. Some things are easily understood. Some are old, like old terms that no one uses in modern Tibetan any longer, or in Tibetan they still use. Yeah.
They also have a Sanskrit letter?
Well, they have a way to sound out Sanskrit words, for instance the mantras, but they're not always correct. I mean, it's like there's a word Vajra, which is part of the Sanskrit. Like there are mantras that have the words Vajra in them, but the Tibetans pronounce it Benzai. I don't know why. Benza, Benza. So Vajrasattva is Benza Sattva. Yeah, it's... I suppose also, like, my guess is when Buddhism was introduced to India, to Tibet, many Tibetans traveled to India, received first learned Sanskrit, and then translated the teachings into from Sanskrit into Tibetan. Actually, there was a written language. There was already a written language before, but the written language that they already had was too basic, so they had to work on that and transform it into a language that could really translate Sanskrit well, so that it's possible. Like sometimes the syllables are the same.
So it's possible to literally translate Sanskrit into Tibetan. They did a great job. And now when many texts are no longer available in Sanskrit, they still have them in Tibetan. Yeah. So it's really like it's like a refrigerator. Put it all on ice. It feels like that Tibet being so cold, being difficult to reach, being difficult to get to. So therefore they never really suffered from invaders, except of course the Chinese now. But before that, it wasn't like they were invaded again and again by these groups and those groups. So they were able over more than 1,000 years to preserve it really well. And you have the original teachings, they've not really been changed. Not really been means they haven't been changed. And I told you about Raj, the Indian man Raj. He said it's incredible how accurate the translations are from Sanskrit to Tibetan, at least the text he read. And what he also said, that there are a lot of Western scholars now who have learned Sanskrit, but they don't really properly learn Sanskrit. In that, he said it takes a really long time to learn Sanskrit, but they take a class, 1 or 2, they can use a dictionary, and then they think the Tibetans didn't do a good job in translation. But if you have an expert like Raj who knew Tibetan, he taught himself Tibetan, and he could really compare the two. And he's really thorough. He was very thorough. He was very particular about it. I don't think he just said it without really examining. And he read the entire text that I was translating and said, incredible. He said sometimes there were slight differences that didn't change the meaning, but most of the time it was pretty literal. And he had the experience with many texts, he said, like that. And he didn't understand the criticism of some Westerners and the different universities criticizing the translation. And he said, he couldn't say for sure, but he thought their Sanskrit just wasn't sufficient. They didn't know the level of Sanskrit that was required. And that was probably also the level of Sanskrit the Tibetans had learned at the time. So this is, I think, important to know, because you have more trust in the source. Understanding the source was really well prepared.
Do you speak Sanskrit too?
No. I know a few words that I learned, I picked up, and that's it. Yeah. And also, unfortunately, there are not that many texts that are still existent in the original Sanskrit language, because it was destroyed in India. I think it was the Mughals who invaded India, and they thought Buddhism was really it was very much against their own religion, and they destroyed a lot of it. They burned down the libraries, for instance, of Nalanda. Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately. All right. I guess we could start. Who's still missing there? Oh, that's you. And then Gita? Gita and her daughter, yes. So they're not here. Okay, maybe Gita will come later. Shubham? Okay, they're still with the doctor. All right. Okay. Now let's look at the paper I gave you. Shall we read the paper? And I didn't spend much time on inherent existence, because we will discuss it again, and I already did. I didn't see any need to also include it just at the very end, but the other 2 types of selflessness. And there's so many other types of selves we make up. I mean, it's not limited to these 3. I mean, there is not the type of self that is propounded, or that is mentioned in the Christian religion, in the other religious systems. There's not the self that Sigmund Freud talked about. I think we come up with all sorts of ideas what the ego is. Yet, so there are all these different types, but in the Buddhist scriptures, they narrowed it down to those 2 here. Those 2 coarser types, of course. And they're all created by humans based on the sense there's really something there. Right? Okay. So first, the lack of a permanent partner's independent self. The coarsest form of selflessness is the absence or the lack of a permanent partner's and independent self. The misconception of its opposite the belief in the existence of such a self. So the lack of course, is the selflessness, but the belief in the existence of a permanent, partless, independent self arose before and during the time of the Buddha. So before the time of the Buddha, there were already philosophical systems that posited Atman, and they didn't describe it that way, but it basically came down to believing there's a self that is permanent, static, there's a self that is partless and independent. So when did it arise? Well, during a time when followers of various non-Buddhist Indian philosophical systems engaged in extensive analysis and debate about the nature of the self. So these philosophical systems, they were incredible, so sophisticated, which is why it's often seen that the Buddha came at a time when his teachings were truly understood. I mean, karma was already accepted, reincarnation was accepted, suffering was seen, suffering having a cause. There was an understanding that the root misconception, the mental afflictions were a problem, attachment was a problem. That was all recognized. Many of the techniques of meditations had been, but no one spoke of no self. There was a view of a self. So that was the difference. Yet still, for many experts, scholars, practitioners, Buddhism wasn't that difficult to understand because of the great similarities. Yeah, so historically, sometimes it's good to know, even without knowing all the details. But I think it's quite beautiful to understand historically. What I also always find very fascinating is, well, some years ago, one of my teachers who's from Ladakh, who's from Leh, he asked me to participate in a conference they had on women and Buddhism, or women in Buddhism. And everyone who was, well, every participant had to write a paper on that topic. Oh no, it wasn't on Buddhism. No, it wasn't on women in Buddhism. It was about Buddhism in general. But one topic was, and that was my topic, women in Buddhism. And of course, I had to prepare the paper that I was supposed to present, or that I presented. And I did a lot of research on Buddhism, on women at the time of the Buddha. Now, sometimes it seems that at the time of the Buddha, I'm getting a little off topic, but you may find that interesting, so I mention it. From our perspective, it seems, wow, you know, women had a really hard time at the time of the Buddha. There were all these misogynists putting down women. Even the Buddha himself didn't allow women into the order right away. So, taken out of context, it seemed pretty terrible. But understanding it within the cultural context, it was a revolution for women. Because from what I researched, at the time before the Buddha came, 1,000, 2,000 years even before the Buddha, women had a lot of rights in India. There was like a, what do you call it, like a high time, like a special time for women. I don't know how much literature is left of that, but I remember clearly reading that, yeah, women had a lot of rights, but then that changed at some point. And what they call, I think, the Brahmanistic kind of tradition became more prevalent, with women being the properties of their fathers, brothers, and husbands. It pretty much changed. So some of the descriptions that I saw reminded me even of nowadays India, especially in the villages, or I don't know how strong it is still in these villages, but when I first came, for instance, when you die as a parent, you always want to have a son, because when you die, someone has to light the funeral pyre. And that is sometimes seen as moksha, that takes you to liberation. But only if your son lights the funeral pyre. Is that tradition still? So you need to have a son to attain nirvana or moksha, some kind of liberation, through this fire. It's quite different to Buddhism, that's for sure. But yeah, so this idea, you need to have a son. and this obsession basically with male children, which is not unique to India, of course. In the West it existed in the same way. In some areas still exists. But the point is that the Buddha, at the time of the Buddha, this was very prevalent. Men could leave their home and become monks. Women's place was at home. That is, until they got married, then they were sent off to their husbands' houses, and they were supposed to remain there. And if they didn't like it, they couldn't go home. They could not return to their parents. And that is, I think, so true in many areas in India. If you are married off to a husband and the husband doesn't treat you well and you want to leave and go back home, you cannot. You can't go home. So it's therefore, for a woman to leave her home and want to come back, it's impossible. So at the time of the Buddha, when the first monks had been ordained, then the women also wanted to become ordained. They listened to the teachings, attended the teachings. So the Buddha's actual mother had passed away, but her sister had then taken on the job to raise the Buddha and became like his stepmother, his aunt and stepmother. And after the Buddha had left home and become enlightened after many years of spiritual search, she sought out the Buddha with a group of other women, asking the Buddha to ordain them, and the Buddha said no. Now that seems really misogynist. And then on behalf of the Buddha, his disciple Ananda, he asked, on their behalf, he asked the Buddha, and then he agreed. But the way I look at it, it was like, you better think about it well. There's no going back. For the guys, you can go back home. You decide this is not the way of life you want to live. You give back your vows. You live back home in your ancestral home again. That's fine. For women, you'd be homeless. Where would you go? It wasn't like these days now. You find somewhere to go, get a job, get an apartment, and be done with it. It wasn't like that. So really understanding the context, the Buddha saying no meant think about it. If you're really certain, so really make sure this is what you want, because this is a lifetime commitment. There's no going back. But then he gave this permission, and it was huge. This was the first time women lived, at least historically, I don't think there's any record of women living just with women, administering themselves, taking care of themselves, going out for alms round, and being only responsible for themselves, without a man owning them or looking after them and administering. So that was huge if you think about it. And the Buddha also saying, once there was a king who lamented he only had a daughter. So he was like, I just had a daughter, I want a son. Like his wife had just given birth, possibly to their first child, and he was like complaining. And the Buddha said, a girl is good, a daughter is wonderful. And he convinced him how wonderful it was that he had a daughter. Again, quite unusual. And many times he said, women and men, I find even the Heart Sutra indicates that men and women are equal, because everything said in the Heart Sutra, even if it comes from the mouth of Avalokiteshvara, is attributed to the Buddha. And if you remember, Shariputra asked, how should a son of the lineage practice? And what is the response? A son or daughter of the lineage should practice. So it's like, do not leave out leave out women. This applies to both men and women. Sometimes there are different versions of this translation, but the translation I'm most familiar with, it starts off with Shariputra asking, what about man? And then Avalokiteshvara saying man and women, basically. So he was actually a revolutionary when it came to women's rights, but in comparison to what women's rights are nowadays, it seems pretty minor. However, in the context of what was possible for women, it was pretty amazing. Yeah. So anyway, we need to put it into perspective to understand where the Buddha was coming from. So to understand also why the Buddha taught in a specific way. Well, because of the philosophical existence systems in India at the time. And one of these systems, or many of these systems, and to go back to this handout, so they were interested in what is the self, what is the I, and since most of these systems accepted the existence of past and future lives, they were especially concerned with identifying the self that continues from one life to the next. They recognized the constantly changing nature of the 5 aggregates and understood that neither the body nor typically memories or knowledge of the mind were carried over to the next life. That was obvious from experience. Therefore, they concluded that only the self continues, that it must be unchanging, that self, that neither body nor mind could be parts of it, and that it had to exist independently of the psychophysical aggregates, because otherwise it couldn't move on its own. In order to account for continuity across lifetimes, so that continuity of a self going on across lifetimes, continuing on across lifetimes, they thus posited a self more stable, so unchanging therefore, than the fluctuating or changing psychophysical complex that has no parts, one that has no parts and exists independently. As a result, many asserted the existence of a permanent, partless, independent self. That is, a self that is unchanging, of course, permanent, without a self that is without mental, physical, temporal, or spatial parts, right? So physical and mental is clear because the self continues, but the mind and the body don't. So it can't have parts that are of a mental or a physical nature. Plus it exists independent of mind and body. But also temporal parts would be, it doesn't exist of it's not consists of sub-moments that are constantly changing because it's permanent, right? And spatial, like left side, right side, what would that look like? I mean, like, you know, having a right side, a left side. So those were not its parts, and it was partless. Plus, it existed independent, or it's existing independently of the 5 aggregates, thus independent. Such a self can be likened to a pea inside a jar, a pea in a pot, a pea in a jar. The jar representing the aggregates and the pea symbolizing the self, residing within, so kind of like body and mind, that's like the jar or like the pot, and the pea is like that independent self. Residing within until the aggregates, mind and body, that is, disintegrate at death, at which point the self moves on to another rebirth. So that was their view, basically. From a Buddhist perspective, this kind of self is untenable. It doesn't make any sense. If it existed, it should be identifiable as something separate from the mind and body. Should be able to look for it and then find it. Moreover, such a self would remain completely static and unaffected by the mental and physical experiences, something clearly at odds with our lived experience or our lived reality. Because here we're not looking for some kind of self that no one understands. We're looking at the self, we're searching for a self that we are attached to, right? It's because we have a strong sense of I, we do perceive a self. It appears to us, we perceive it at times. The question is, how does that exist? It's not about positing something totally separate that is at odds with our own experience. It doesn't help. We're not attached to that, right? So therefore, from a Buddhist perspective, this kind of self, this kind of permanent, partless, independent self doesn't make any sense. If it existed, it should be identifiable. Oh, sorry, I already read that. Therefore, Buddhist standard holders, Buddhist philosophers assert the absence or the lack of such a permanent, partless, independent self. Excuse me. And understanding this absence constitutes the coarsest level of realizing selflessness. So that's said to be, that's really understood. Of the 3 types of selflessness here, that's the easiest to understand. There is no permanent self. There is no partless self. There is no independent self. And again, it seems, oh, philosophically, yeah, they have this view. This has got nothing to do with me. I didn't live 2,600 years ago, or at least I don't do now. I may have lived then at the time, but who cares? For me, how is this relevant to me right now? How does this concern me? No permanent I? Well, we can take it apart. Just think about it. Again, bringing this back to how to make this relevant in our daily life, in other words. So, for instance, it's permanent. Okay, so the self is permanent. Well, it appears that way, doesn't it? It seems, again, that experience we have, it's not like we think the self doesn't change. We don't have a mind that thinks, oh yes, we do sometimes, I never change. Sound familiar? We're frustrated with ourselves. We really want to change the mind, maybe reduce anger, reduce, I don't know, arrogance or attachment, whatever. We really make an effort. And then we act in a certain way, in an uncontrolled way, and we go, ugh, I never change. Have you had that thought? I never change? Right? Yeah. Oh, I never change. Or another person says, we feel about another person, we feel like, oh, they never change. They're always the same. They will never change. Yeah, there's similarity, but to think that the person now and the person yesterday, they're exactly the same, which would mean they're identical, which would mean there's not even the slightest change, right? So that doesn't make any sense. And in fact, it's similar. They're very similar, but never the same. So they have changed physically. I mean, sometimes we may think, oh, because the difference doesn't seem to be that drastic. For instance, physically, think about it, logically. So me yesterday and me today. When I look in the mirror, I don't see a difference. When you look at me, if I ask you, how did I change from yesterday to today? You don't even notice that my hair has grown a little bit, and I won't notice either. So you may think, she's probably changed a little bit, I just don't see it. But actually my body has completely changed, because there's not a single part that is the same as yesterday. Why? Because I'm made of atoms. And since on the molecular, on the atomic level, these atoms from yesterday until today are not identical, there's not a single part I can point at that is exactly the same. Am I making sense logically? So when I say, oh, this part hasn't changed, I'm just saying, I don't notice the difference. That's really what I'm saying. But logically, every single atom, and I'm made of atoms. If you talk about my face, okay, my face hasn't changed, you would say. But that which my face is made of, subtle atoms, they have changed. So if the building blocks have changed, how can the whole not have changed? Does that make sense? Does that logically make sense? Right? So actually my face has completely changed, but not changed into something that looks totally different. That's the difference. So it has completely changed, but not noticeably. Now, what about my mind? It's the same idea. It's not the same mind. My mind today is not my mind. It's not the same as yesterday. Like, for instance, my sense consciousnesses, they perceive things that weren't there yesterday. Now, their objects are different, and they depend on their objects. Therefore, the mind is different. Since the sense consciousnesses have changed due to the change of their objects, the mental consciousnesses that arise from those, thinking, oh, that was good breakfast, that was delicious, now it's raining again, and so on, they have also changed. And the people that I encounter, it's different situations, new situations, every day is uniquely different, even though we don't notice. Therefore, the mental consciousness must have also completely changed. Thus, we have totally changed. Am I making sense? But it feels like, oh, I never change, I'm still the same. So a sense of permanence in this case. But even without reflecting on change, we believe myself yesterday is still me today, and guilt. Yesterday we talked a lot about guilt, how guilt functions. First of all, guilt functions in such a way that we perceive the fault that we feel guilty about, or whatever we did that makes us feel guilty. The person who did that is the same today. Identify with that person from the past. Wrong. Completely unrealistic. Secondly, I neglect the fact that the I has parts. And if I made a mistake, let's say 5 years ago, something that I may not just regret, but feel guilty about, which is an exaggerated version of regret, then I feel I am that action. I am that mistake. I'm not understanding, it's just a part of me, just as there are many other parts that I have. No, I am that mistake. So you see how understanding that the self doesn't exist as a permanent entity, it has parts that are not itself. It's very important to deal with guilt. It's important with feeling humiliated, having been bullied one day, right? That doesn't mean that the bullying was right, that was not okay. But we feel kind of humiliated, we feel belittled. Even now, we may feel belittled. And again, we are not that person. Secondly, what was belittled is not every part of that person. Some parts were untouched in that sense. Yeah, we got upset in that moment. However, not every part was harmed by that. Our good qualities, they didn't. It's not like you were previously really good at languages, and because you were belittled, you can suddenly not speak another language. You see what I'm saying? Therefore, it's good to understand then part of that pain, we can just let it go. Right? Being a victim, for instance. How do you label being a victim? That time when it happens to you, you are a victim. You're not a victim now. Right? I was a victim. We even use the past. I was a victim. I'm not a victim now. But being a victim, it means like if I'm still a victim, I can't change the past. And therefore, I'm stuck in that. Doesn't that feel that way? I'm stuck in being a victim. This has become my identity. But that's just mental. That's just the mental kind of attitude, like holding on to that continuously and creating so much pain. And really, if you look at your mind, that's one of the first steps, as I said in the beginning. How is this practical? Don't just look outside of yourself to recognize guilt in others. It's kind of like, yeah, it's always over there. Oh yeah, my neighbor has a lot of guilt. My neighbor feels like a victim. And we oftentimes ignore that we have the same. And sometimes we're really just not aware of it. And it's just a matter of recognizing, oh, there's still some pain festering from that time when someone did something. Face it full on. Face it full on. And to then go, okay, this is not saying that they didn't make a mistake. Don't get me wrong. No one is saying this didn't happen and it wasn't cruel and it wasn't terrible. But this pain that I'm still carrying with me, now that just comes from my mind because I'm no longer experiencing what upsets me now, right? I'm no longer experiencing it. That's the thing of the past. Now I need to learn to deal with it, but only if I fully understand it. Can't force it. How does the self exist? Thoughts, what are thoughts? What are emotions? They're not something solid. They feel so real. They may even trigger a response in your belly. But that is just the energy. Every mind comes with an energy. And if that mind is very, very disrupted, very upset, the energy accordingly, like when you're nervous, what do you get? Butterflies in your belly. That is because the mind is so nervous, the energy of the mind is such that the mind itself is such that it influences the energy it is connected with to perform the same movement, if you like, that kind of jittery kind of feeling. And a lot of our emotions, they are seated in terms of the energy in our belly and affect our belly. You know, like how they say in modern science, our belly is the second brain. We usually assume our mind is just in the brain, but why is it called the second brain, our belly? It shows that a lot of the emotions are seated in the belly, I guess, and it feels that way. For instance, when you're nervous, you have like butterflies in your belly. Does that feel like that? There's like a feeling there's something going on here. It would make sense that that nervous mind, the mind being located here, the energy being located here, and affecting, the mind affecting the energy, and the energy affecting the sensation in the belly. I suppose heart is more in this area because we associated it with the heart. And it's not just a cultural thing that has no grounding. I believe this goes back to experiences people had, and so they passed that on, and it's been passed on in that way, whether we really have a sense love is in this area or not. It's quite interesting, isn't it? And modern science, once again, moving from the brain and actually talking about more than two, not just this. And I saw like the other day, there is another documentary I haven't found yet. I don't know how to get. I think it's called The Body. And there they talk about all the different parts where the brain is in other parts as well. In other words, the mind is actually not just up here, as the Buddha said 2,600 years ago, right? That it is usually not necessarily so much in the limbs, which is also possible, but in this kind of main area, accounting for the different experiences we have. Does that make sense? So it's important to recognize, to get to know these emotions, get to know those that pop up every now and then, especially those from our childhood. They're so deeply seated. They're much deeper, buried, but since we were little and didn't have good ways to deal with them, they may still be very raw and they've never been dealt with. Childhood fears, childhood traumas. It's better to access them gently and, you know, get to know them and look at them and the hurt and everything, because otherwise they will continue to create trouble, continue to harm our relationships, possibly with the people involved. It's just a healthy way to deal with it. And all this can help us. All this is part of this. This can help us, really can help us. We need to have the courage to face it because oftentimes we're scared of it. And this is the first step towards, well, generating more love and compassion. First, deal with what's in the way to that love and compassion, the acceptance of ourselves, and then acceptance of others. It sounds like a lot of work. Well, it is. There's no quick fix. But might as well start, because it's really rewarding. It puts your mind more at ease. Whether you want enlightenment then still or not, well, at the very least, it helps us to deal with things better. So this is Buddhist psychology, in the literal sense of the word, psychology. Recognizing our harmful emotion, our difficult emotions, facing them, facing them, recognizing them, facing them, and finding ways to let them go. Okay. You see how this is all connected to understanding the self better. Am I making sense? So let's look at the second type of self, or the selflessness, which is a little subtler. The lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Yeah, here the self in this title, self, in Tibetan there are different words. It's rang is of the self-sufficient, it's rangyat, and da is self. So in English you have this repetition. You could also say the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. That would also work. So to avoid the repetition, yeah, self-sufficient, substantially existent self. You know, the Tibetans have a lot of words for self. Na, da, rang, and probably even more. and a lot of words for mind, for consciousness, yeah. And so in English sometimes we run out of words and we don't want to make up some words that don't mean anything to us or have a totally different meaning. Okay. Anyway, the understanding of the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, or I, counteracts the misconception that such a self exists. Right, so you have the lack of such, and we have, of course, the mind that holds on to the existence of such an unrealistic I. And again, it comes from our innate sense that there's an inherent I. This misconception is subtler than the one before, so than the one that apprehends a permanent, partless, independent self. It's subtler. It's harder to understand. Well, here, because it's more difficult to realize the absence of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self than the absence of a permanent, partless, independent self. It's easier to understand that the I doesn't exist as permanent, partless, independent. It's a little harder to understand it doesn't exist as a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity. Consequently, the misconception that such a self exists is harder to overcome. The wrong view that such a self exists is more difficult to weaken and to eventually overcome. What is self-sufficient? What does self-sufficient mean? Self-sufficient here means that the self is perceived to be an owner, controller, and utilizer of mind and body, which may or may not be apprehended as independent of them. So, the self is seen as the controller of mind and body. And to me it feels the same way. To me it feels my I is in charge, and my I, sometimes the mind does its own thing and the body does its own thing, but to a certain degree, to me it feels there's this I that is like the controller, exactly, is the boss, the owner of my mind and body, and it's that which I need to protect. That's what I feel I need to protect, right? The permanent, partless, independent self, the previous one, was a lot less like, it was not in accordance with my own experience, actually. It's not a permanent, I mean, sometimes it appears permanent, but it's also active. And if it's active, it must be changing. It's actively engaging, so it may appear permanent, but if you were to ask me, is it always the same? Then I can tell you, no, it's not. The only reason that I believe it's permanent is that it seems to be the same as before, and the logical consequence would then be it hasn't changed. But it does feel as if it was changing. Very important. So this kind of self, very much aligns with my own experience. That's the one constantly talking to me in the back of my mind. You also talked about it talks to you. It's always like, oh, don't do that. Oh, this person is rude. Say something back. It's kind of like, it's like talking to me, like, oh, there's this cake. There's a bigger piece to the right. Be quick to get the big, right? It's your favorite cake, jump. Or whatever else, right? It's a time that is the loving one, and it's the selfish one. So really, it's the mind doing it. It's the mental consciousness. Sometimes it's the self-centered mind. Sometimes it's the loving mind. Sometimes it's the calm mind. So it's the mental consciousness that's just switching to different minds. And unfortunately, oftentimes, these mental consciousnesses that are now active are very harmful. But they're conceptual. That is, their thoughts. Conceptual and thinking mind is the same. A conceptual mind and a thinking mind are the same thing, and it's never still, especially when you try to meditate. It seems to be talking even more if you try to be single-pointedly focused on your breathing, right? When I said today 4 hours focused, Tyler went like, oh. And I thought, yeah, right? It's like, oh yeah, I tried that this morning. 4 seconds was the longest I managed. How do you do 4 minutes? Forget about 4 hours, right? Because it's constantly chatting away. That's what seems to be the self. The constantly talking one. The one that talks, that always comments, that tells me, get the bigger piece, no one is watching. Or, or what else? Run faster because the bus is about to leave. Or, it's like, but it's really just the mind doing it. However, we believe it to be a separate entity that now needs to be preserved, needs to be protected. We don't really feel like, I have to protect my mind, I have to protect my mind. In association, of course, yes, associated with the I, but it's mainly the sense of an I that needs to be protected. So it's not that difficult to understand that this is pretty crazy and, not in accordance with reality. But of course, we're so used to it that it's one thing to say, yeah, it doesn't really make it exist, and then turn around and it's continuing to run wild because we've been doing this since we were little. At least have the sense there's this owner, there's this thing we need to protect. And especially when we don't pay attention, it just does its thing. And we just act. Yes?
Also, like we tell children, you should have known better. Like, as if there's a controller that should have known.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
I should have known better. Exactly.
yeah.
Very good. There are a lot of times when it becomes obvious how we, like, I take it personally. I should have known better. What else? Yes.
Like in psychology these days, there's this inner child healing. You have to imagine that there's this inner child who is neglected because as you're older, let's say for example, you seek out validation outside. So then the psychologist kind of tries to work and say, oh, you didn't get validation enough as a child. So now you can give validation. So rather than waiting for outside validation,
You learn
imagine
to.
there's an inner child inside you, visualize that, and then give it that validation. So to me, all of that seems like, wow, it is strengthening that sense of self so much,
Well, the thing is also like you end up with having an innate sense and then an intellectually acquired child. So you end up again with two. There is the inner child that's constantly me, shouting. And then there's the owner and the controller that sometimes is the adult and sometimes the child, depending on how childish it gets. That's interesting that actually, yes, in modern psychology, we do recognize that sometimes this inner voice, that owner, can be very selfish and sometimes very wise. We can be very, gracious when it comes to, oh, you take the bigger piece. And I really want the other person to have it. And at times, depending how hungry I am and how long I didn't have that favorite cake, I can be very selfish. So instead of feeling, oh, my owner can be selfish and mature at different times, I create a child and an adult. But it's true though. I do meet adults, of course, that are very self-confident because as children, there was never a situation that got them insecure or something. Like I said, the Tibetans are very interestingly self-confident in that they're I don't want to mistake it for shyness. They can feel shy. I don't want to talk to this person. No, I don't know them, and being shy. That's not the same as self-confidence. To me, self-confidence is to be content within yourself. Be okay the way you are. To not feel like you're nothing worth. You're not worth anything. Your view doesn't count. You don't want to talk about it because that's something else. I mean, knowing my view sucks because I don't know what I'm talking about. That's different, right? I mean, in situation, like I know there's a situation, people talk about things and I have no idea. So I know I better shut up because I really have no idea. I better listen and hopefully I learn something. But there are other situations where I know and I have the confidence to say it. So here I think, or I'm shy, but that's again different. I'm shy, too many people, so I don't want to speak. Therefore, I think low self-confidence means you feel low about yourself. You feel you're not equally valuable. Your opinion will not be valued, or there's something you just can't do. You will never be able to do. So like an unrealistic. So in a way, it's like an unrealistic low sense of yourself, which is not in accordance with reality. It's extreme. That I would call low self-esteem, which is different to shyness. And it's very interesting, yeah, like with modern science, we do have this, so there are minds that have low self-esteem. And that goes back to our childhood, possibly, not exclusively. However, it is childish. We are sometimes childish. Identifying that as a child is okay, but it makes it confusing because there are a lot of beings within you. Actually, it's the mental consciousness. It's actually the mental consciousness, yes. So it feels like I should have known better. What else? Usually, sometimes in a certain context, I hear something and I go, oh, there's another one, where it seems to suggest there's a separate self. I took it personally. It was a personal attack. So it wasn't my mind, it wasn't my body, it was the I that was attacked, right?
Even when we say I was just thinking about it,
Mm-hmm.
like
I was thinking about, well, that's different because then you label the I on the thinking mind. I mean, you have to refer, you see, it's not wrong to say, I'm thinking when your mind is thinking. Because we label I on what the body does and on what the mind does. So there's no problem. But when then we believe, oh, my mind knew, but the I didn't know. You know, if you end up thinking, oh, my mind kind of knew. Or the opposite, I kind of knew, but my mind didn't. But that's like impossible.
like I don't know what I was thinking types.
I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know what I was thinking. Oh yeah, that's a good one. I don't know what I was thinking. As if there was like, the mind does its own thing and I don't know what I was doing. I don't know what I was thinking, yeah.
I just thought of it now because I didn't know what I was thinking.
Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know what I was thinking. Like, but in a way it also shows some kind of involuntary kind of, I don't know what I was thinking, I just did it and then I realized. So it depends on how it feels. But yeah, sometimes the way we talk seems to suggest the mind does one thing and the I does something different. Okay, which is impossible because, well, unless the body, of course, we label I on the body, and then the body, I was laying still, but my mind was going crazy. Okay, that's labeled on the body. The body was not moving, but my mind was active. Here it's okay. But when, whatever I say, I don't know what I was thinking, it's like there's an I that's separate from the mind that is thinking. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, I'm sure you come up with your own kind of versions of certain sayings. Going back. Okay, so self-sufficient. What does self-sufficient here mean? It means that the self is taken to be an owner, controller, and utilizer of mind and body that may or may not be apprehended as independent of them. So I perceive a self-sufficient I as an owner, but in relation to my mind and body, I may perceive that that I is independent of mind and body or not. So in other words, such a self can be conceived in two ways. Two ways to conceive it: as completely independent of mind and body, while serving as their owner, controller, and utilizer. Or, alternatively, as a distinct entity from mind and body, yet dependent on them, right? Still functioning as their owner and so forth. So in both cases, the mind, so the way we perceive of the I is as an owner, yet in one case as independent of mind and body, in the second case as dependent on them. The intellectually quiet one is the first one. When you see the self, you perceive the self, you regard the self as separate from mind and body. That is not an innate, inborn sense we have. The second case, that is one we are born with. At times, you don't need to be taught. You have a sense, yes, there's a self dependent on mind and body, yet its owner. Does that make sense? Yeah, one being intellectually quiet, the first one intellectually quiet, the second being innate. Does that make sense? The first view resembles the coarse misconception of a permanent, so it resembles the coarse misconception of a permanent partner's independent self only in that it takes the self to be independent. So the first permanent partner's independent, perceiving the self to be independent of mind and body, is similar here to perceiving the self as independent of mind and body. Is that sentence clear? Is it or is it not? You're not reading.
Yeah, listen.
You're listening, okay. So the first self resembles the Course misconception, is similar in other words. The first view is similar to the Course misconception of a permanent, partless, independent self, only in that it takes the self to be independent of the psychophysical aggregate. So in that way it's similar, but only in that way. Does that make sense? However, unlike that Course misconception, so conceiving a permanent, partless, independent self, the mind apprehending the self as self-sufficient does not apprehend the self as permanent and partless. For as the owner or controller of mind and body would have to be changing and thus consist of temporal parts. Is this sentence very complicated?
The parts are also the mind and body.
Yes, the mind, exactly. So in a way, but here because it's like the totally independent of mind and body, a part is always linked to that, which is the part possessor, if you like. In a way, it's very difficult if you believe that owner to be totally separate. How would then mind and body be a part? But it's made at least of sub-moments because it's impermanent. Yeah. So, in other words, when you say permanent, partless, independent, you perceive the self as independent of mind and body. That is similar to here, independent of mind and body, in the first case of perceiving a self-sufficient I. Okay. Otherwise, it's different. In either case, whether you perceive the self as totally separate from mind and body or not, but perceiving it as self-sufficient means the mind conceives of an I to which body and mind belong. An owner and controller that is distinct from them, it's not the same, possessing, governing, and utilizing them while thinking mind. Right? Feels that way as like a real owner. Moreover, if this self is regarded as existing independently from the five aggregates, there may also arise the sense that one's own mind and body could be exchanged for another. You could actually change your mind and body. You could I could kind of exchange with Yudrin. I could take on her mind and body, myself enters hers, and she becomes me, as if that was possible.
Wasn't this thought part of Course herself, being a pot analogy?
No. The pot analogy, you can also apply the pot analogy here to the first type of self-sufficient. So the self is not permanent, it's not partless, but it's still like a pea in a jar. So, okay, maybe I should have added that to make it clearer. So in the first case, here you have these two, 1 and 2, right? I numbered them 1 and 2. In the first case, you perceive the self as self-sufficient in the sense not just as an owner, but totally independent of mind and body, like a pea in a jar. And in that sense, you could also visualize, you could also come to the conclusion, I could change with another person's mind and body. Yeah? That would allow that to, of course, that's totally impossible, but just that thought that it's possible. Yes, so however, unlike that Course misconception, the mind, moreover, this self is regarded as existing independently. If this self is regarded, this self-sufficient I is seen as existing independently from the five aggregates, there may also arise the sense that my own mind and body could be exchanged for another. I could switch places with someone. As though the self could become the owner of someone else's psychophysical aggregates. So that's what self-sufficient means, the two meanings here. Here, substantially existent means that the self is thought to exist in such a way that it can be identified or conceived without relying on the identification or conception of mind and body. So not only does the I appear to be self-sufficient as in like an owner of mind and body, but also to my mind it seems I can, if I look long enough for it, I can think about the self without even thinking of mind and body, because they're so different. Is that, how can I mean, if I ask you to describe the self, you always describe mind and body, because the self is merely labeled on it. If I ask you to talk about this house, this building, say anything about the building that is not saying anything about its parts. It's impossible because this building is merely labeled on the basis of its parts. On the basis of the parts of this building, right? Its temporal parts, so yesterday's building, today's building, tomorrow's building, and its other parts that are arranged in a particular way, I label Thosamling, not just prayer hall, but main building or whatever, right? Main building, because I'm including not just this hall, but the whole building. I label that. So how can you describe Thosamling's main building without referring to anything that it's made of, without referring to its parts? It's impossible, is it? But especially when it comes to the self, we do have a sense that even buildings have a personality, have a self. Like, for instance, with cars, I usually give the example of cars. They seem to have, like, it's almost like they have a mind on their own, or they have like a being within them. Like there is something inherent within them, and thus there's like a being there. I think that's very nicely expressed in cartoons.
Apparently it is psychological because the designers made it that as a headlights look like eyes because we tend to connect and get attached to it more.
Oh, the car is actually made that way to look like a face. That's interesting. Well, my mom used to always give her car like a name. My dad had his car, he didn't name that. And my mom had her car. And as it was appropriate at that time, my dad's car was bigger, my mom's was smaller. How we just followed the patterns. My mom was smaller and my dad's was bigger. And my mom's was up on the road and my dad's was in the garage. Or sometimes my mom's was there as well. But the point is she always named it. She gave it names. Yes?
I wanted to ask if maybe we think it's outside and controlling, and like different from the mind and body,
Mm-hmm.
because we try to think how people see us,
Mm-hmm.
and then we like imagine there is like how do you say, like a reputation.
A reputation.
Or like how people perceive us from outside.
Yes, yes, yes.
And then we like glue it to control, like
To our sense of how we see ourselves? We bring the two together, or?
we bring it together, and because I try to find something that is not the mind and not the body.
Oh.
So I thought maybe we hold on to like the outside image that we think we have in society.
Yeah, which is not the body, it's not the mind. It's kind of connected to them, but it's still something different. People see us as different. Yeah, I have that sense as well. I know that the way I see myself and others see me will be different, that's for sure. But it's interesting as you bring it up, like trying to imagine how do people see me? And having also a sense they see an I that is separate from mind and body. Of course, I know that they do see me through my body and through my mind, but somehow believe that they see something separate. And they may do that because we do that anyway. It's not just that we perceive ourselves as a different owner, we see others also as an owner. We see others as existing in a similar way, actually. That's just not mentioned, really. Usually it's just mentioned, well, no, you could also see, this is not just the I, it could also be transferred to any living being, like having an I that is an owner and so forth. So you could transfer it to the permanent part, this independent self. It doesn't just refer to this I, but everyone else's I, and then other living beings. So when we perceive them, there's also a sense, for instance, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It's not just his body, it's not his mind. There's really something there. It's someone we perceive as like really special. It's even stronger. It's even stronger. A stronger sense that there's this special being within him. It's not the body, it's not the mind. Right? Does that make sense? Again, and this is the one we become attached to. When we are attached to another person, is usually, yes, the body and the mind to some degree, but mainly that person. When we get upset with them, yes, the body and mind are somehow involved, but it's mainly the person we get upset with. We get angry with the person. But the person we usually hate or are upset with is the one that doesn't exist. That separate owner and controller. And for us it's so difficult to think, you know, they were under the control of their anger. But they're the controller, right? We have to be reminded by Shantideva when he says, oh, when we get angry with the stick, we shouldn't get angry. Well, when we get angry with someone and they hit us with a stick, we don't get angry with the stick. Why? Because it's under the control of the person. And then the next step is, well, don't think you're under the control. You should think the person is also not under control. They're under the control of their afflictions. But then we're thinking, yeah, but they're in control. It's them. They did it. They were in control. They had all the power, basically. Right? I mean, it's a bit like when a person doesn't know what they're doing and they're killing someone out of a moment of insanity. Only then do we accept they're not in control. But other than that, we always feel like free will, this idea of free will. We have a sense every person has this free will. Independent of mind and body, they can make a decision. Isn't that right? Yeah? They know what right from wrong. Yeah, they had the incredible urge to kill someone, but they were in charge and they could, as if there was that person who's making that decision. Right? There is like this separate, when in actuality they're two different minds. One mind that is very, very powerful, and in this case negative, and then a more positive mind that is kind of not that powerful, and the other one. But that doesn't mean the person doesn't have to be disciplined for it. Right? It explains it. It explains the situation, and it avoids, or it prevents anger and hatred towards that person. But that doesn't mean this person doesn't need to learn a lesson, because that mind that is not strong enough needs to grow, and the negative one needs to be reduced. So they need to be disciplined. Am I making sense? All of this is so important. In every moment, in every situation, we should bring this in. Yes.
So let's say that the old world understand the meaning of emptiness.
Yeah, everyone. Oh, wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, like, there is a mind and body.
A person.
I don't know.
We can still label person. We're allowed to say person. Yeah.
And then the person kills someone.
Yeah.
So you actually discipline his mind when you're punishing for what was done?
Well, let me ask you. Like in your case, let's say you're doing something that wasn't okay with your parents, right? And they ground you. You can't go out. You have to be at home for the next 4 weeks or something. Is it more, the punishment, does it feel more mental or more physical?
The punishment is physical, but like you say.
Why do you suffer?
The source of it is the mind.
Yeah, it's the mind, exactly.
You discipline the mind.
Yeah, absolutely. You discipline the mind, absolutely. So the body, yeah, it's mainly like you're craving to see different walls, basically. You don't want to be cubed into, you don't want to be kind of left in your room the whole time. So it's really mainly the mind, right? The body's lying down on the ground or the body's lying somewhere else. It's really, to the body, doesn't make much of a difference. Maybe you want to see certain things, like see something different. But it's usually the mind. So when you put someone in prison, whenever we say the person did this, the person did that, most of the time we're referring to their mental state. I mean, they robbed a bank. Okay, it's not the mind that jumped in there with a gun, it was the body that did.
The mind is like kind of the source of everything. Like the body is like useless without the
Exactly.
That's what you say?
That's it. The controller is the mind, actually. The mind.
After taking everything is first of all the mind, and then
Yeah.
the body. And
Yeah,
then
absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.
are there cases that it's different? No, it can't be.
Pardon?
Like I'm trying to understand or to think if there are cases that
It's the mind. It's mainly the mind.
can be the way like opposite.
I don't think it's the body. Sometimes the body influences us in the sense that hormones in the body may make us feel grumpy, or may feel us have incredible love for a living being. Yeah, you see this little being. Honestly, it's when babies are newly born, they're pretty ugly. When they're really newly born, I don't think they look pretty. My nephew, when he was born, the birth was so difficult. It took like a whole day and maybe a second, like maybe 24 hours, and couldn't get through, and it got stuck. So this head was disformed. It was like elongated, only for a short time, but still, he was bright blue, reddish blue, right? And my sister, they took so many pictures after he was born, and my sister is laughing about it. She looks at these pictures and goes, "That's what he looked like? When I saw him, I thought it was the most beautiful thing in the world." So in that moment, her hormones, they influenced her brain to such a degree that she considered that child to be so beautiful. And then a few months afterwards, she looked at the pictures again and what was I thinking? But she knew, of course, it was hormones. So in that situation, the body does influence us, how we see things. Especially here's the eye consciousness, that's very much dependent on the brain. So the body, of course, does things as well, but mainly the mind. The mind is the main aspect, I would say. So when you discipline a person to put them in prison, it's the mind, basically. And you see, you may think, so what's all this big deal? Okay, call it the mind, call it an owner. There's not much difference. What we talked about as the owner really becomes the mind. And that's it. Seems like such a tiny shift. But the implications are huge because we are attached to this owner. We're not attached to the mind. We may not even believe in the existence of a mind. You can live your entire life believing there's no mind and believing there's this owner doing its thing. And it's that owner you're attached to. That's what we're craving. That's what we're angry with. All our afflictions are directed at that. And if that's not there, what is it directed at? That's the whole issue. Right? At that something there, that self. Something there. Because remember, self-centeredness is attachment to the I and mine. And the self that this self-centeredness perceives is either an inherent I, or a self-sufficient I, or maybe a permanent partner's independence I. Some I that somehow doesn't exist. Always exaggerating what's there. Never perceiving the merely labeled I and being angry. You cannot be angry at a merely labeled I. Can't. Seems weird, right? I mean, like, why not? It's merely labeled I. Can I really, do I need to protect my merely labeled I? Do I need to protect it? I don't need to protect this merely labeled I. Unless I believe there's a little more. Very difficult to get there. If it was just a merely labeled I, there's a mind, there's a body, it does its thing, what do I need to protect? I mean, I should protect because it's still valuable, it can contribute to the well-being of other sentient beings, but that's not why I usually protect it. You see, we just create, we project something more concrete than there actually is, and then all these exaggerated emotions arise. That's our problem. Maybe it doesn't make sense. Does it make sense? Ronnie, does it make sense?
It's tough for me to understand.
It does. You don't understand it?
I kind of understand.
Yeah, kind of understand it.
But still, it's tough.
You know, that's very good. You kind of understand it. I get that you kind of understand it because I kind of understand it. Why? Because there is the view that makes sense and the way I look at the world. And those two clash. Those two clash. Because I've been so used to seeing the world in a certain way, believing in this I, and then every now and then I hear it doesn't really exist, and I go, yeah, sounds nice. But then a moment later I'll go back to the old way of seeing things. We're so habituated to this way of seeing things.
We will all be like, okay, I'm mind.
Yeah.
We all know that we are mind, that's bad.
Yeah.
So still there is like a responsibility for this mind.
Yeah, of course there still is responsibility.
And if I have a responsibility to something, isn't it make it like a bit more like important in my eyes?
If you do what? What is the last sentence?
If like I have a responsibility for that
Mind, yes, you do.
Isn't it make it like I have a bit more
I see what you're saying.
More important for me
Ah.
because I'm the one that's going to.
Yes, you're right. You're right. Okay, she brings up a very good point. She's saying, okay, there is no self. It's the self that exaggerates the importance of the I. But do I not still have responsibility to look after, doesn't my mind, in other words, so it's really not the separate self, but doesn't my mind have more responsibility to look after its own self and its own body? Yes, it does. In fact, it's all it can. I can not look after myself, I cannot look after you in the same way I can look after myself. That is true. That is true. There's no contradiction here. But we're doing more than that. We're not just looking after ourselves. We are trying, it's not just about survival. It's about finding more happiness.
And if it's only about survival?
Then we wouldn't have a problem. If it was just about survival. If we were just like machines or something. I mean, I don't want to say like, you know, like a machine just trying, or like a plant just trying to, I don't think plants are selfish or something. There's no war, the war of the trees or something. I think an example would be like where a tree just tries to survive, but it doesn't harm other trees. In fact, its existence supports everyone else around. And of course, there are no bodhisattva trees. I don't go around and, okay. But in a way, you see, there's this very slight problem when we think about it. So survival is important. We need to look after this mind and body. It's alive, and life is precious. Human life is precious. So that far, we don't have a problem. And we're doing that anyway. We're doing a good job staying alive, usually. But sometimes we actually kill ourselves because of our attachment to the pleasures, short-term gratification. So we eat the wrong kind of food. So in a way, we harm ourselves. It's not just survival. If survival means not just for a few years, but as long as possible. However, our exaggerated sense of an I, it wants to survive, but it also wants this, it's attached to pleasure. So if it keeps me alive, if I eat spinach every day, and it gives me so much displeasure, if it wasn't about just being attached to pleasure, I would just eat spinach. Am I making sense? So Ronnie, your example, if it was just, I'm running out of ways of saying it. What I'm trying to say is there is a normal way and there's an exaggerated way. There's a normal way. So every affliction has a normal counterpart, a realistic counterpart. Our self-centeredness is extreme. Our anger is extreme. Our envy is extreme. Are there realistic counterparts? Yes. For instance, my self-centered mind, which considers my survival more important than that of others, and doesn't stop there. It's not just my survival, it's my happiness, my gain, my reputation, my praise, and my success. I don't need all of them for survival, by the way, right? So what would be a mind that is not extreme? Consider looking after my survival, but not at the expense of others. So let's kill 10 people, that's okay, as long as I survive, for instance. And not just that, let's eat whatever we want. Let's drink, because then people think I'm cool. Let's get drunk every night, because then people think I'm cool. When that becomes more important than my own health, when instant gratification is more important than long-term benefit, then I've already fallen into an extreme.
So it's okay to say that the self-centered mind, if we take all like the desire for happiness and to do things in order to feel better, and only like remain the part of the surviving.
Yeah.
So is it okay to say that the self-centered mind is not a bad thing?
Yeah, exactly.
And then it's like
Yes.
we kind of want to, I don't know if to reduce or maybe delete it now because we need to go to the other side, but if after we've done a lot of work and then like the normalized thing or like something that makes sense is saying, okay, it's good that we have self-centered mind
What? It's good.
Like, if like, in summary, after we do all this work and understand these things,
Yeah.
is it okay to say like the self-centered mind is good for our surviving and it's not a bad thing?
No, it's not the self-centered mind, it's the self-preserving mind that's good. A self-preserving mind is okay. It's important. You see what I'm saying? Just look at what is the extreme version and what is the normal version. What is the version that is in accordance with reality? The self-preserving mind. The mind that wants to stay healthy and strong. That's okay. We need that mind. So we're not saying we're totally off whack. Like I'm not suggesting that we've totally gone crazy and we're doing only crazy things. There are parts of our mind that are very important. So the self-preservation, that part we need to preserve. And since self-preservation is only possible if there are others, it's important to preserve myself and others. I need to include others, unless I lived in a bubble. Am I making sense?
So it's not self-preservation, it would be preservation for all in that way. And you could
Yes,
say
but
that the
no, but look, I can't, no, there is a difference. There is a difference. I cannot make others eat. I can only make myself eat. So, in other words, there is more, my mind can do more for this merely labeled I versus others. But it could do more than it does right now when it's self-obsessed. You see what I'm saying? So it is true that I can only really effectively keep myself alive when, for instance, someone else doesn't want to stay alive. If they want to kill themselves, I mean, there's only this much I can do. So, but I have responsibility for others. And right now, because of my self-centeredness, the problem is I've gone to an extreme such that I'm willing to kill others for my own benefit and even kill myself and harm myself in order to have some short-term gratification that is not actual happiness. You see, anytime we're extreme, we're harming ourselves. Any extreme, that's just in the nature of things. Drink too much water, it kills you. Breathe in too much air, it kills you. Eat too much spinach, it kills you. Anything that is too much.
Like, if like this self-centered is not that exaggerated, is it fine to be existed, you know?
No. The thing is, I don't understand the words. Speak a little slower. I understand. What you say makes perfect sense as long as I understand. So if you speak a little slower.
I'm saying, you say that we exaggerated everything.
Yeah, not everything. We don't exaggerate all the time, but when it comes down.
For sure we have exaggerated.
Yeah.
So if it wasn't that exaggerated.
Yeah, if we didn't have this exaggeration.
Yeah. So that's what I meant. Like if it was okay to say, okay, we have the self-centered. It's not that exaggerated.
Yes.
It's crucial for our surviving.
Yeah.
And then it's okay.
And then?
It's okay to have.
Yes. You see, like an arhat is someone who got rid of all this exaggerating mind, and now, without considering themselves to be more important than others, which is where all the trouble starts, then they can act in such a way that they don't kill themselves, they continue to exist, they have more time on their hand to also look after others. Although they're limited in what they can do, they do what they can. So, for instance, as an example, for the fact that I can only really just preserve myself, the example is a Buddha. A Buddha cannot give us his or her realizations. A Buddha can give him or herself these realizations. In other words, work towards them, meditating on these minds, removing the obstructive minds, generating the positive minds. A Buddha can do all that for himself or herself, but cannot do it for us, right? So the Buddha cannot meditate for us and realize for us emptiness. Okay, So that let's say it's easier. He can only do this for himself. But does that mean he has to totally ignore us? No, he can show us how to do it, so we can do it. So a Buddha or an Arhat, they're measured in their still looking after that which they can really look after most efficiently, themselves. But without believing they're more important. Believing that others are equally important, however, that everyone needs to look after themselves, we can only show them how to do it. So it's really the same mechanism, so the same actions, talking to people and interacting with people, eating, drinking, but without that exaggerated part that harms us and harms others and restricts us. I actually really like that Ronnie brought this up. This was the first time someone has actually put it in that way. I like that. Isn't there also a measured way to do it? Don't we have to look after ourselves? Because it may seem like we have to neglect ourselves. And isn't it true that we do have responsibility towards ourselves? And yes, absolutely. So again, with the middle way, don't cut too much away when it comes to getting rid of self-centeredness, like totally neglecting yourself and just allowing yourself to die. No, that's not what we're saying. So again, she did a really good job in like going from one extreme to another extreme so we can find the middle. Yeah, Ronnie, that was great. It was frustrating for you to tell me what you really meant because I couldn't get it. But you're right. You're absolutely right. So there is an extreme way, and it's not about totally stopping any activity to do with the self. No. You still have to look after yourself, have responsibility for others, and know what you do for others is not the same that you can do for yourself.
So is it mainly the attachment that is the
Yes. Yes. Of course. The attachment. And what does the attachment do? It exaggerates how the self exists. Why does it exaggerate? Because it perceives the self to exist in a more concrete way in which it doesn't exist. It adds to the mode of existence, right? It perceives the self not being merely labeled on the basis of mind and body, but there being something separate and distinct.
in continuation with what he was saying.
Nitsan, yeah. Nitsan? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That on the basis of what my mind or this mind and this body in a combination have done,
Mm-hmm.
there is a sense of achievement or a sense of accomplishment or a sense of skills that I'm good at now because
Yes.
of the work.
Yes, exactly.
And that's the mind and the body.
Yes.
There is a sense of this is what Shabari can bring to a situation or
Yes.
whatever.
Absolutely.
But that feels like the moderate.
Yes, the moderate version. That's a nice way of putting it, yeah.
But it is when there is an attachment. How come they didn't call me to?
Yeah. Yeah.
I know how to do this.
Yeah.
I'm so good at it.
Yeah.
I've done it so many times in the
Right.
past.
There are someone else, but I'm actually a little better, a little more important. Very good. That's the problem. Absolutely, very good. If you're good at something, that's okay. Offer your service, it's fine. But if someone criticizes you, okay, that's fine as well. So the mind and body didn't do its job to the satisfaction of that person. But now there's an I that's hurt. How dare they say that to me? So you see, there's a kind of this extra part that I've created in my mind and that has become so vulnerable. If I just create an extra part, it doesn't matter actually, but when it becomes vulnerable, then it's a problem.
And the attachment is the vulnerability.
Yes. Seeing it extra and creating this illusion that this is more precious and more important, its happiness is more important, more precious than others, it needs to be, reinforced all the time. So again and again, so I created this extra I, believe that to be more precious and to be more, its happiness to be more important, and I expect everyone to act like that. I expect everyone to recognize, you guys, I'm special. Please show me. But you feel you're special and you're busy with getting everyone to accept that. So we have trouble with other people, right? We're all aiming towards the same exaggerated thing. So it's almost like, you know, like an extra part that's never existed that we create and now feel is more important.
Yeah. And the reason I think why capitalism works so well is because it makes you feel like the resources are limited. Unless you're the most important, you won't get access to that thing.
Absolutely. Capitalism works so well and communism doesn't, because in communism, you get all this, the communist ideas are like, no matter how hard you work, you all get the same. So there's no appreciation of that I that's a little bit more important. There's nothing that makes it feel more special. And others could get away with working less, you work harder, and they get the same. Yeah, that's why it doesn't work. Capitalism only works because, exactly as you were saying,
There's a false sense of scarcity.
yeah,
And unless I am the most important in the
yeah,
group, I'm not going to be able to get whatever it
exactly.
is so limited.
Yes.
But that's not even true.
That's not even true, and it's again exaggerated. Yes. So from a Buddhist point of view, as I said before, in the context of polyamorism or whatever, remember I said, from a Buddhist point of view, the communist idea, without like having a dictator at the top, but just that idea itself is actually great. It makes perfect sense. Everyone gets the same, equal opportunity, no high class, low class, but with our present mind, it's just not going to work. It's not going to work. I guess, you see, like the monasteries, they work a little bit like a communist state sometimes. If the monastery works well, of course there are also higher positions, but it's less about, whoa, it's more about responsibility.
You told us there was like drama and all the chaos. I was thinking reality TV show for the monasteries.
Well, there can be, you're right, of course. There's definitely also sometimes drama and stuff, but they can control it to a certain degree. They do try to keep it low key. Sometimes we have unrealistic expectation that everyone is basically just sitting there meditating and smiling at each other. Now that's a surprise that they don't. But these huge monasteries sometimes, and it always depends, there are times when it's better and less, but it's really like the monks, what is incredible, everyone works for the monasteries. They don't get paid, and they all do their jobs, and they feel I'm doing and giving something back to the community. And they do it really well. That's quite impressive. So because there's, of course, virtue that you accumulate, but it's also the Dharma is preserved, it's precious, so I do something. There's also that kind of attitude, and it's never totally pure, because otherwise they'll all be in Buddhas or Arhats and so forth, but it's slightly better than in other places. So it's kind of like sometimes like a communist in a good way. They still have hierarchy, but it's not like those with a higher position, they now feel more important than others, but rather feel like they have greater responsibility and work harder. It's really beautiful. They're not like, you guys, you better look up to me. It's more like, whoa, I have more responsibility. Now I have to really look after you. It's really quite beautiful. And again, not perfect. The way I put it last time, don't be surprised, was when we have very unrealistic expectations. We don't find nirvana in a monastery, but depending on the monastery, it's pretty impressive. It's pretty impressive. Also the nuns, really impressive. Like some of them work so hard, they don't get any money. It's their job and they give their very best. It's for everyone else. And they may not always get along with everyone else, but they feel it's for everyone else. Oh, let's take a break. Let's take a break. It's time to take a break. Should we do that? When was the break? 3:30, right? 3:20, I think. Yeah, anyway, let's take a...
Time flies when you're having fun.
All right, anyway, okay, we have a little bit more to read, then we do the meditation on emptiness. Great, okay.